Okay, so welcome everyone again to our Wednesday session. This is number 4 now. And just to refresh where we've been and where we're going, we started off the week with Vicky Balabansky giving us an excellent Bible study on Colossians. And we're going to end the week with Dr. Deborah Guess talking about eco-theology, the church and the environmental crisis. And the workshops we're having through the week, all of these that we've had are now up on the Presbytery website and on YouTube. So you can look at those, or maybe think of other ways you might be able to use them with other people that weren't on the session. But tonight we have Mark Zirnsak talking to us about being a green church. So we look forward to what you're going to bring to us, Mark.
Thank you. And I'm just checking, am I able to share my screen?
Yes, absolutely. Yep.
Great. All right. I will pop that up. Hang on. Yeah. Okay. Now look, I will try and avoid death by PowerPoint. So look, I used a PowerPoint. I normally don't for my talks these days, but this one particularly because I'll talk about lists of things you can do, I thought it made more sense to actually have it up as a list, so you could actually see it. And look, the other thing I would stress right from the beginning is tonight I'm going to talk about all the options that might be available to you. And really, it's not that I would expect any congregation to be looking to do all of these things. You probably need to look and see, what works for us while working in our community. And, even if you start small, that's great, and look to build from there. So it's certainly not what I try and avoid is you feeling overwhelmed. Oh my goodness, we can't possibly do all these things. So it is more just offering you the range of options that might be there. So, why be a green church? I think you've already had, my understanding is you've already looked at some eco-theology and you've looked at some theological rationales. So that is, for us as a church, why be a green church? It is about connecting our theology with care of the environment. And just briefly touching on that, I'm going to suggest that the theology has shifted more towards in most mainstream theology, a more sort of eco-theology framework. And in very simple terms, that simply means that we now start to see humanity as needing to live in harmony with the whole of creation. So it's, and that's probably a shift from stewardship. So stewardship, probably, which is a frame I certainly grew up in the church with. It might be not sure for others whether that was also the frame. Stewardship sort of says humanity is at the pinnacle of that. So it's sort of, you can justify that out of Genesis 2 or even possibly Genesis 1 as well. And sort of say, well, humanity sort of, God's put it in charge of creation and we're there to be good stewards of it. Eco-theology takes more of a view that we live in harmony there, and it fits more with the right relationships. Now, these are simple theological frames. I'm going to suggest to you there is a huge variety of theological frames out there that can be applied to our relationship to the environment and to creation. For example, the World Council of Churches recently produced a book on theological reflections from across the world, and that ran to 360 pages. So I'm just introducing that to give you a bit of theological background there. In terms of uniting our Synod's positions on climate change and the environment, our earliest resolution post-union dates from 1977, where there was already a call for the Synod buildings to be energy efficient and installation of solar heaters. As you can see there, we then moved through a range of other calls on congregations from 1992 to that we should be using reusable cups. 1993 we should do energy audits. 1993 again that by 1995 90% of our paper use across all the church, including congregations, should be from environmentally preferred sources. And you'll see there that by 2011 there was the setting up of an energy reduction management committee within the Synod to respond to climate change. Now, I think one of the challenges we face here is that our Synod meetings have often been very good at calling on us to do things. The reality of implementation has unfortunately probably not matched the ambition of those resolutions. At this point, I'd be very interested to hear from yourselves tonight about things that your congregations might already be doing around being a green church, connecting with the environment, before I start talking about what some of the other options might be. So is anyone happy to weigh in? And I can stop sharing.
We installed solar panels on the roof, so we have that installed.
Great. So which congregation is that?
This is Euroa.
Euroa, okay. Anyone else?
I'm from Hillsville Uniting Church in the Yarra Valley, and we installed solar panels as well. Yeah, we've purchased, in the process of purchasing rubbish bins that are specific for people sorting out the different wastes so that they can be utilised in the best way.
Chukamoama have solar panels.
And the Murchison church in the Waranga group also has solar panels, and in fact they get a regular check from Origin Energy. We actually put more in than we use, so it's a source of revenue for us.
We've been quite concerned with the COVID regulations when we're serving morning tea. So we've been trying to work out ways of serving morning tea without using plastic and landfill stuff.
Great. For those who have got solar panels, I'm interested, what's been your experience? Have they resulted in cost savings? Do you export to the grid?
Yeah, most certainly at the moment, but during COVID it's a little difficult because we're not using the buildings to that extent. But we're finding that it's great. We've also installed a dishwasher in the kitchen, which saves a lot of hot water. And yeah, we're still to find out. I haven't gone into the accountancy part of it yet, but it certainly seems as though it's doing a good job, including the manse.
Great.
Yeah, we're making money out of them too.
No, excellent. So that's you know, one of the benefits. I mean, obviously there little bit of caution with installing them on homes in some parts of Victoria that unfortunately, due to limitations of the grid, you've now got some providers have started restricting people being able to feed energy back into the grid. So that's just something that when people are installing on their homes to be wary of. But normally if you're doing that, an installer will tell you whether you can be able to export into the grid, and it's something that they normally should be checking before you get an installation done. It's not happening to a lot of people, but it is just something to be a tiny bit aware of. I'll jump back to sharing. Yeah, hang on. Sorry, just trying to, there we are.
Just on paper, Mark, sorry, the use of paper. I mean, certainly with the use of overhead projectors and data projectors, we've, pew sheets are almost, are a thing of the past overwhelmingly, and that saves a lot of weekly paper waste. Even our newsletter over COVID has become mostly electronic.
But ours has increased because we do more than half electronic, but we've got other people that we deliver to who don't have internet. So we've gone up a bit.
Okay, helpful to know. All right, so this is a list of the kind of things that you might look at doing. So obviously you could talk about the environment within your congregation, and I'll come to, there's a variety of resources out there. One of the things that we did look at was, do we need to produce more resources out there for congregations? And when you look at it, there are a lot of high quality resources that are already produced, an awful lot of material targeted at churches and congregations. And I'll run through those a little later as to, some of the sources of those. They often come with a variety of theological and denominational flavours. So depending on your own congregation, you probably need to have a bit of a look at the different resources and figure out, don't stick with one, probably have a look at a few and see what's probably going to work best in your congregation in terms of engaging with members, depending on where they are and what's likely to appeal to them in that space. But there's no shortage of those kind of materials out there. Now, I notice, as you've indicated, quite a few of you have already installed solar panels. The other choice that you could make is to switch to green power. The only thing with green power is it tends to be more expensive than ordinary purchase of power. So it's, whereas in solar panels, you kind of get a cost. You have an initial upfront cost, but obviously you recoup over a period of time. Green power will cost you more throughout the life, but depending on, now the Synod actually has a special deal with Power Shop. So if any congregation was interested in green power, we certainly can make you aware of the Synod deal, which is a cheaper rate because of that, but it does allow you to then use entirely renewable energy. The other benefit with green power, or one of the arguments in favour of green power, is that it actually is about building up the whole grid so that the benefits flow across the entire community. The critique of solar panels can be that they benefit the community or the people who have the solar panels on their roofs, but don't necessarily benefit the entire grid per se. So there's a little bit of debate around equity on that, but I'd certainly still encourage the adoption of solar panels, but I'm saying green power is obviously another option that's available there. Obviously consuming less, and I think that's a message we've all heard before, turning off lights and putting hot water systems on timers are the kind of things that would have been spoken about. Still interested in certainly in some of the central Synod facilities, turning off lights is still a significant issue. So we're probably behind quite a lot of congregations on that front. Getting an energy audit done would be another thing that a congregation could look at doing. And I'd be interested as to whether any of the congregations on the call tonight have had any experience of having energy audits done. No? Okay, so look, the advantage of an energy audit is that it doesn't just, it will look at things like your energy consumption and where you might have some savings on that, whether you can change, the types of light globes you might be using that might save you power. I mean, some congregations, you would find they might still have the double tube fluorescent lights, and you can find that removing a single tube and leaving just one tube, if that's something you haven't already done, can give you sufficient light for the needs of that space. But they'll also look at things like, where can you get energy efficiency? Are there gaps where drafts are coming in that are causing the need for greater heating, or those kind of things? So an energy audit can be a worthwhile thing to get done, and it'll throw up a range of options then that might be pursued. And quite often some of those options will also have a cost saving attached to them, as well as being good for the environment in that point of view. Transport is another one that transport emissions in Australia are the third highest out of all emission areas in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And again, so therefore there's advantages at looking Are there ways to reduce transport use? Can you ride share, combine trips? A bit harder in rural areas. I absolutely accept that. But there might be some times when that works. And also, can we walk or ride more? Again, that might be a challenge depending on the area and the distances involved. There certainly is. There's a Ride to Church Day globally, so that's something that a congregation could think about encouraging its members to get involved with, for the right group of people in the right location over the right distances. Another thing that is available is the possibility of creating an environmental plan for your congregation. Now, this is something that some of our congregations have already been doing. Brunswick Uniting have certainly developed their own plan, and they're very happy to talk to any congregation that might be interested and talk about what process did they undertake and how you might get involved. I think they adopted a good model of trying to involve as many of the congregational members as possible, so that it's designed by the congregation members for the congregation members, and trying to get that deep engagement, so that it's not something that either the minister or the ministry team are imposing on the congregation, but trying to get that broad ownership across the congregation. You can also look at, to the degree that any congregation has investments, are they held with an appropriate ethical provider that acts to support the environment. Now, obviously, ethical would fall in that category, but if you're holding them in other places, that's something to consider, and I'll come back to where you can get some resources on that. Recycling, now that was mentioned just before, but I think whereas in the past, recycling was promoted just generally without qualification, we've moved to a world where, unfortunately, recycling has now become more complex, and the latest evidence is in some cases recycling can actually be worse for the environment than not recycling, depending on the type of product and how it's done. Now, the reason for that particular shift was largely actually to do with China, that there was a period where China was happy to accept materials from the developed world and do the recycling. And what was happening was they had relatively low labour costs. So the unsorted material that was being shipped from developed countries to China was simply sorted in China, and they made it economic, and people were getting paid. A lot of recycling businesses were getting paid by China to take that. China decided to stop doing that. And the result has been that the business model that previously existed, where money could be made by these recycling businesses by shipping it to China, has disappeared. Further, the fact that people were not properly sorting their recycling or throwing things in that contaminated the recycling has meant that if you now try and recycle it here, the costs are prohibitive. So it's actually meant the recycling business has taken quite a hit. That said, you can recycle wisely, and there are certainly things that should be recycled, and there is an awful lot of work being done by both the Commonwealth and state governments on recycling at the moment. So there are initiatives being taken, and there's also initiatives to try and eliminate some of the waste that we would have previously shipped overseas, things like tyres, to no longer be that. So there's some really positive initiatives by both the Commonwealth and state governments in this recycling or elimination of waste area. So that's really positive. Use of environmentally friendly timber and wood products. So certainly we have encouraged the use of Forest Stewardship Council certified timber and wood products. So you'll see that it's a little label whenever you're buying something. Ideally, you should be looking for the fully recycled product. FSC Forest Stewardship Council does offer what they call a mixed product, which will be some recycled material, but some new material as well. So it's a lower, from an environmental point of view, that's a lower quality. You'll also find on some timber and wood products, including things like toilet paper, you'll find PEFC certification. That is generally of a less environmentally friendly form of certification compared to Forest Stewardship Council. So they're things that can be done in that space. Now, we have also set up just recently a Synod Climate Action Task Force. The idea of the task force is it's open to anyone in the church who might have an interest in helping the church across all its bodies do more to address climate change. So if anyone here was interested in being part of that, please get in touch. You'd be very welcome to join. The idea with the task force is to identify things that we could do to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to encourage, facilitate and assist all parts of the church in taking that action. So it's not to tell others what they should and shouldn't be doing. It's very much about trying to assist people, guide them, help them, give them ideas that they can act on. And my final point on what you can do is make your voice heard. So that can be a matter of talking to others in the community, or, you know, as we often do from within the Justice International Mission area, it might be political advocacy. So writing letters, engaging with your local MPs on these kind of issues. Look, that can be more tricky, particularly I think since the period when Kevin Rudd was Prime Minister and Tony Abbott was the leader of the opposition, action on the environment generally became very politicised. And I think that made it harder to really engage sensibly on these issues and have reasonable discussions within the political realm, but often things are very politicised in this realm. There are exceptions to that. And as I said, for example, the work that's currently being done on recycling and reduction of waste fall into that category. All right, so the next couple of slides are lists of resources or sources that you can find resources to take action from or to resource your church in taking action. Again, I'm not in any way imagining you would look at all of these. It's merely to give you an idea of some of the better ones that are out there that you might tackle in this space. So starting at the top, Uniting Earth by the Synod of New South Wales and ACT has a whole range of resources on the environment and climate change, and that's certainly worth having a look at. Uniting World has produced some resources, particularly around dealing with anxiety about climate change. So they've done, and they obviously have an international focus. So they have some good resources about how climate change is impacting our Christian communities, particularly in the Pacific, where we have quite a lot of work. And the World Council of Churches have some great resources, particularly targeted at young people around engaging with the environment and particularly around climate change. The Australian Religious Response to Climate Change, or ARC as they call themselves, have a very comprehensive kit. They produce kits for a range of different faiths, and there is a kit particularly for Christian churches to be involved. Seasons of Creation, they do an annual church service resource that you can tap into, but that may not be, the way they produce that resource may not work for everyone. Now down the bottom there, I've got Seed. Seed is actually a Indigenous, so First People climate action movement. So they produce some resources. If you're interested in looking at some resources that have that perspective from the First Australians, Seed is a place that you could go to for that. In terms of other resources, Sustainability Victoria have great resources if you want to look at theirs. They've got some really good material around getting energy audits done and installing solar panels. Similarly, Solar Victoria has really good resources about, you know, a guide to, if you want to get solar panels installed, Solar Victoria has some really good material to help you do that. The Victorian government itself has produced, if you look up energy efficiency scorecard, just on the internet and Victoria, it should take you through to a link that has that energy efficiency scorecard that you can use to audit your own home or your congregation. Now, the next ones, I've listed a bunch there that are all about talking to people about climate change. I mean, the Yale Climate Connections is about talking to younger people. The three after that, the Australian Psychological Society, Psychology for a Self-Climate and Reach Out, they all have good resources for dealing with climate change anxiety. So one of the things that is obviously out there and that we're encountering is, particularly for younger people, but it can be across the board, with this fear being that's out there about climate change and the impacts it might have, and there are very real reasons to be concerned about this, but for some people that leads to very high levels of anxiety. So there are resources there that if you're finding, you know, people in your congregation or people in your community are feeling deeply anxious and it's having a very negative psychological impact, there are resources out there to be able to have those conversations with people, or even if you're raising the topic, learning how to raise the topic without creating unnecessary anxiety or fear for people. I've listed there's a documentary called 2040, which is a really positive documentary. Has anyone actually seen it, just out of interest? No, okay. So it's an Australian produced documentary. It's very focused on solutions. So it's a very hopeful documentary. There is a David Attenborough documentary that came out roughly the same time. David Attenborough's documentary is very strong on focusing on the problem and stressing the impacts, but probably fairly, I would suggest to you, much weaker on the solutions or giving meaningful solutions. Whereas the 2040 documentary is almost entirely focused on technologies that are already here and things we could do to basically take action. The ABC Fight for Planet A is also another good resource, isn't it? And it has a carbon counter with it. I should mention there are Victorian government grants available. So if your congregation was thinking of taking action on something, it's worth having a look and seeing if there's a grant, if financial resources are one of the issues that might otherwise hold you up from being able to do that. I've listed there Market Forces is a body that provides information about ethical investing from an environmental point of view. So whether that's superannuation or who you bank with, they're great for looking at that. Environment Victoria has some really good resources about reducing emissions from transport. Probably people are familiar with, there's the ABC War on Waste, which was both a documentary series, but also on the website that attached to that documentary, there's a whole bunch of resources around recycling that you can access. And similarly, Planet Ark and TerraCycle also have some good resources on recycling that will help you recycle efficiently. All right, I'm going to just briefly run through communicating on climate change. So there's a lot of work, a lot of research being done, quite a bit of it being funded by some of the larger environmental organisations, looking at how are people thinking about climate change, how are they reacting to climate change, and how best to communicate to people about climate change. And what they've found is, depending on the research, they normally talk about 5 to 7 segments in the community. So they break the community up into 5 to 7 sort of groups and classify them by the category. And I've listed some recent Australian research there. So there were 5 segments that people were slotted into. So there's the group that's the alarmed group. So they're the people who deeply believe that climate change is a threat and that we need to act and we're not doing enough. There's the alert group. They similarly believe climate change is a threat. They're probably less certain about what can be done to address it. So what's being found is communicating with them is often about encouragement towards action that might work. The concerned group, similarly, they also see climate change as a problem, but are not probably quite at the point of doing much in terms of acting on it. The cautious group believe in climate change, but often doubt whether human behaviour is actually influencing the climate change that's taking place, and they're a fairly small segment. And then there's a very small segment, which is the disengaged. So largely they're the people who don't see this as an important issue at all from that point of view. Now, what's been interesting is communication that actually focuses on solutions is often far more effective across the board than trying to argue the points about the impact of climate change or how harmful it's going to be. So, for example, a bunch of research sort of showing here in Australia currently, it's over 80% of people believe that there should be an expansion of renewable energy sources, a phasing out of coal, and that's even if they're sceptical about climate change. So even if they don't really believe climate change is an issue, they'll be supportive of increase in renewable energy. And the figures show it's only about 14% of the population, or 1 in 7 people, actually believe that we should be having any further coal developments of any sort. The other thing, there's quite a bit of debate within, we certainly get it from some congregations about, whether we should be calling for a climate emergency or a climate crisis. That is language that the World Council of Churches has adopted, for example. The research tends to show that language works really well for the alarmed group, so it resonates with them. They, if you already believe that climate change is a major impact and is going to have huge impacts, that language works well for you. But the research tends to show it does tend to push away people who are the concerned and cautious groups. So they become less interested or less likely to take action and become more disengaged when that kind of language is used directly with them. There is quite a bit of debate around this, and there is a whole movement of people who are very focused on that all language must use the climate emergency language. People like Extinction Rebellion, who will argue that it's only through fear and anxiety that we can drive people to action. At least for some of them, that is the arguments they are publicly making. I think the research doesn't support that kind of argument. So I'm just raising this because when you're thinking about talking in your congregations, I'd be suggesting very strongly you look at ways of embracing the whole congregation, not blaming, looking at what you can positively do, and not necessarily needing to get into debates about how bad climate change actually is or how bad environmental problems actually are, but getting on with being able to do the positive things that allow for that sort of engagement. And my final area is just to talk about advocacy. So that goes back to that previously where I talked about, ways that you might look to get involved. This is the stuff we do from a sort of a Justice International mission area and looking to try and involve as many people as possible. So with the advocacy, we have been arguing, and this sort of flows out of a resolution that was passed at our 2021 Synod in February. There is a need for rapid and steady progress to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The Synod has adopted a position, basically, there should be no new fossil fuel developments and a phasing out of the existing fossil fuel extraction. Now, that will require some adjustments within the economy, but the evidence we believe is that is achievable, but that is something that can be done. It's a matter of being willing to put the resources in to make that happen. And it's kind of very strange at the moment to see a federal government intervening to, for example, say they're going to build a new gas plant in New South Wales, when even the gas industry people are saying, we don't want you doing that. And in fact, it's just going to make the market even harder. So even those who are supporting gas say this kind of government intervention to sort of promote fossil fuels is not helpful. We are also advocating for a just transition for communities impacted by the shift that needs to take place. So the thing you don't want to have happen is, you shut down a coal-fired power station somewhere with no plan for the community, and then a whole lot of people are thrown out of employment and huge social impacts on the community. So there are places around the world where this kind of just transition has happened, where governments have planned ahead and have made sure there is, it's never going to be a perfect transition, but that there's better outcomes for those communities. Germany's often held up as the kind of model where that's worked well. We are also exploring land-related options for reducing climate change and seeing how that might play its part in reducing emissions, because agriculture and land have a significant impact on our greenhouse gas emissions as a country. And finally, I should mention, there wasn't a great interest from church members around transport-related emissions. So from a sort of policy area, that's not something we've got to focus on. So I've left there. I think we've got about 20 minutes for any questions or discussion. I'm happy to open it up. I'll stop sharing my screen at this point.
Sorry, Mark, one of the things, I suppose even Zoom would have cut down a lot of transport issues. Well, it's interesting that saying it's not a focus, but it seems to me that we in the presbytery are travelling a whole lot less to meetings these days, and that whole substitution, our vehicles may not be any more efficient, but we're using them a whole lot less.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true, and I think that's also, I think one of the things we've experienced, and probably more so yourselves, is just it's made being able to attend meetings more accessible for people in remote locations, so that it has increased access. I mean, obviously, I think the downside for many of us is we probably feel the social interaction you can have on a platform like this probably doesn't feel quite the same as being able to sort of sidle up to someone while in the coffee queue and have that conversation you've been hanging out to have. But that said, I think, you know, there are advantages and disadvantages with anything like this.
Mark, I think it's Kevin Chapman here. Mark, we were looking at doing some of this thing a few years back and how we could do it. And COVID has pushed us into using technology far more than if we'd just gone along, and we might be only a quarter of the way to where we are now. And we're looking at ways in which we can use it well. And so I think this is good. And I think we are starting to see that really transport is one of the things that throws up a lot of greenhouse gas. And it's good to see things happening, talking about how we use more electric cars, how we use different sorts of fuels like what's a new gas they're talking about producing from
hydrogen is the thing that they're
all these things are now, once were seen as high, you know, somewhere down the track, we're now seeing as no, it's something that has to happen now. And I think, and from the country, I think, I'm a retired farmer. One of the things that really worries us these days is we're getting bigger tractors and doing things much more efficiently, but we're still using a lot of fossil fuel. And how can we do it by doing things less and doing it more carefully are things that I think you can see right through the agricultural industry. They realise now that working with climate, rather than seeking to focus climate to go our way, rather than, you know, which we've done in the past, we're really doing things better, and the opportunities are there. So I think we're on the roll, but I think we're doing it. We're taking a while to get it done. And to see Victoria that at the moment are saying we want to set some really goals to be done within the next few years rather than 2050 is really pushing everybody to look more carefully. And so I think people feel much more comfortable to talk about climate change now, rather than talk to people who were very much against it, are now saying, well, there might be something in this, and are prepared to talk and think about it. So I think we're in a better climate than where we are, than we've been, and I think we're heading in the right direction at the moment. One of the things in our particular council here is that we've now got a green waste bins and a compost thing that's been set up in Shepparton, where compost is being made out of the green waste and is being used in orchards and those sort of things to replace some of those sort of things. So little things are happening around that really makes me think we're heading in the right direction, albeit a bit slow.
I was just going to quickly mention that documentary I spoke about, the documentary 2040, actually has a whole segment on agriculture, and it focuses on a farmer down in Gippsland whose farm was going under, and he swapped to more environmentally friendly farming methods and actually has turned his farm around and made it a success. So it's worth, you know, if you can get a hold of that documentary, and it is around. I actually think it's on some of the streaming services. It's worth having a look, even if you just want to have a look at that agriculture section of that documentary.
Yeah, that'd be interesting. I've written that down to have a look at that.
Mark, it's Chris Serps from Mansfield here. We have a church op shop, and we've found that we can send things to Lentara, our clothes that we don't use or they've been there for a while. We also have a thing where we sell to a company who sends the clothes and handbags and shoes to India, that they make the coloured rugs out of the material. We have Sammy Stamp letterbox on the counter. We collect glasses off people, and we recycle as much as we can. We do quite a good little trade out of recycled bottles and things when it's sauce season. All those things help. Recently, someone asked what can we do with rags or clothes that we can't send to, you know, we don't want to really send it to the tip. And I wrote and explained what we did with our things. We sell, you know, like rags to the mechanics and the farmers and things like that as well. And I got an incredible response from that. Lots of stamps have come in, lots of clothes. People have been bringing in bags which says on the outside rags, so that we don't have to get the ladies to sort through. They're all kept separate and dealt with. And so there's so many different things that we can do. We used to have a full rubbish bin every week, and now it's probably half full. So there's all those things that we're trying to do, and trying to tell people what to do, or show them what to do.
Thanks for that. Good to hear.
Any other comments? What's the mood like in churches around this issue, do you think?
Picking up on Brian's comment there, for the congregations that are present here, is it something that's spoken about in the service? Environmental issues, does it come up?
It quite often comes up in prayers of the people, where people have got a concern about something, you know, when there's been droughts or fires or whatever, and just people asking for prayers for certain things that they've heard of, and we've got quite a few farmers in our group, so there's always concerns there.
Yeah, I'd say a similar thing. It comes up in prayers of the people.
I don't think it's mentioned quite enough.
No.
Around Colvin, Mark, and Clem may want to have a few words on this as well. There's a strong emphasis around just the whole composting and you know, recycling of green waste, and trying to add value to that, and driven by one of the good members of the Catholic Church in Colvin, and but that's a very strong ecological position. John would say that he was a former salesman for John Deere, and you'd say we did more damage with the stuff we've sold than any mines and stuff, just the old farming practices and the need to reform farming practices.
Anybody who has chooks is popular when we run catering activities.
I've spoken about it once at Presbytery. This was after the President's Conference in Fiji, where we heard Vicky Belemensky I've spoken about it a couple of times in church and studies about a different approach to scripture, interpreting it from an ecological kind of hermeneutics rather than the traditional way of interpreting scripture. I find it quite exciting and interesting.
I think it's really hard sometimes to get
Just following on. Sorry.
To get through to people that it's up to every one of us, whether it's changing our light bulbs or whether it's recycling properly or whatever. It's very easy for people to think it's up to them out there to do something rather than thinking it's up to me to do something. And I think I quite often bring that up. They probably get sick of me saying it.
I think that was the approach from the president, D.D. Palmer, when he titled the conference "For the Whole of Creation."
I think, Clem, you were going to say something as well.
Well, yes, just following on from what Brian said about the composting situation around in the Coleman area. I suppose the whole recycling industry is fundamentally flawed in its structure, or has been, in that basically people have a waste to get rid of, and that if you can find someone that for a small amount of money or a large amount of money will waste away, and your problem is solved. And of course, we've seen many examples around the country where it's really been a bit of a racket. People have made a fortune collecting rubbish, or whether it's tyres or waste chemicals or whatever, stockpile them in a big warehouse or somewhere in a paddock out of sight, and then walk away from it. Sometimes setting fire to it on the way. We don't know, but what the composting industry is trying to achieve, and I had a meeting just this morning with them, is to sort of try and complete what we'd call the virtuous loop, that the local government is collecting green wastes, and it's coming up to the Coleman area from various municipalities in Melbourne and all over the state, and goes through a process of creating a compost. The problem has been to complete the cycle and get that compost back into the soil and doing something useful at the end of the line. Now, it does seem that this company is getting close to actually finding an outlet for virtually all of the compost that they're taking in, and it's something like 150,000 tonnes a year now. It's a very significant industry. But what we're trying to do in our little group at Coleman is to convince local farmers that there is some value in using compost, sometimes enhanced to some extent, as an alternative to the traditional NPK fertilizers. The problem is that most farmers are in a situation they've got a $500,000 header that they've got to pay off, and they can't say, well, I'll carry out a process which will reap real benefits in about 5 years. They've got to get the profit this year and next year and the year after, because they've got to pay off their expensive tractor. And so what we're really keen to try and do, and it's not that easy, is to find government funding through Sustainability Victoria or something similar to provide some financial incentives to farmers to follow this path and work to improve their soils through the use of compost and other additives, rather than just treat the soil as nothing more than a medium through which plants grow by being fed with artificial chemical fertilizers. And so there's quite an exercise going on at the moment to to try to move in that greener direction, and just is it's a long process, and that's the difficulty. You can't show instant results, but that's where we are at the moment in Common.
Sounds very worthwhile in terms of the effort you're making there. Just jumping back to Sandra's point, I just was going to quickly mention too, on that point, you actually made a point that there's an author, George Marshall, he wrote a book, Don't Even Think About It, Why Our Brains Are Wired to Ignore Climate Change. And one of the arguments he makes in that book is that because we are all involved in the problem, it's actually much harder to get action. And he actually argues against the standard sort of painting villains doesn't work, because in actual fact, if you want to do that, we're all the villains. So it's kind of problematic from his point of view. So that book's really good on looking, and people still refer to that particular book. It's a very comprehensive piece of work about how to think about climate change environment to try and motivate people. There's quite a few psychologists who argue one of the big problems we've got with climate change is because it is such a long-term problem, it doesn't bear the hallmarks of a kind of crisis that you need to immediately respond to. So I think having all lived through COVID just recently, we've got a very immediate sense of, something that felt like an immediate threat that we're all required to act on. Climate change, obviously, I think people are right to say it's probably a bigger threat to us overall, but it's such a long-term problem that our brains aren't wired to do that. It's not like a car that's about to run you over that you've got to dodge. It's actually something you've got to work at for a very long period of time, and that really plays against the way we're wired to respond to threats as human beings, is the argument psychologists tend to make in this space.
Mark, one of the other things in rural Victoria that's very big is land care, and I'm sure there'll be some here that are part of land care and have been in it over a number of years. And so I don't know whether anyone wants to comment that's had direct experience, or whether you've got some. But I think that's another dimension that while, people struggle with other areas, there's a strong commitment to land care across the region.
Well, no, Brian, I think what it seems that the land care movement generally is waning a little bit. The majority of people who are currently involved in the land care movement seem to be more my generation than my children's generation, and there's less and less government funding around to support the land care movement. In fact, that seems to be a general thing that whether it's your CMAs or your government environmental departments, the level of government funding seems to be dwindling. And I think politically we've got to start to be pushing a little bit to make governments recognise the value of putting money into supporting environmental groups, because they're currently not doing it to anywhere near the extent that they were 20 years ago.
Can I just ask, going back to that issue I raised before about... Go, Clem. Sorry.
No, sorry. Our own group at Coleman Admin, we're trying to participate. We're not actually a land care group, but we're really trying to make some connections with the land care groups that are still existing, but many of them have basically gone into recess. This is something I've actually got a meeting tomorrow with the leader of the National Party, Peter Walsh, to talk about what the government, of course in his case it's the opposition, is planning to do about supporting some of these environmental issues that are being neglected pretty seriously at the moment.
So that does flow into the question I was going to simply ask, because that issue I raised, or the concern I raised about environmental issues having become more politicised, in the sense of being potentially seen to be tied, depending on what position you take, being seen to be tied to a political party. Is that something that congregations experience? Is that an issue that's out there, that people are worried about talking about the environment because it's seen as somewhat political, or is that not the case in your congregations?
I've not been aware of it in ours, that it's political.
That's good to hear. I think there was a period, we certainly experienced a period in that Kevin Rudd, Tony Abbott era, where I know a number of, at that time, Kath James was the environmental project officer, and up until Copenhagen, which was kind of the point at which there was this sort of conflict between Kevin Rudd and Tony Abbott over climate change, congregations were asking her to come and speak every week. So she was out every Sunday speaking at a different congregation. After Copenhagen happened and the politicisation, I think she did 2 talks in the year following Copenhagen out at congregations. It was just like congregations stopped talking about it as an issue. It was really dramatic. It was like a falling off the cliff on that particular issue. So, but we've had a sense that that it has come back as something that people are concerned about more generally, the environment, and have been more willing to engage in. So I really commend the presbytery for picking this up and doing this series of talks. I think it's fantastic that you've taken this initiative, so well done for doing that and being involved.
There was some evidence in Aotearoa of political sides, more conservative versus more progressive, and that was sort of tied to political parties. But it's just more that it probably doesn't get much discussed now. Maybe everybody's being diplomatic.
Now, the final thing I mentioned, we actually
Well, I think in our part of the world,
again, go, Clem, go, sorry.
Sorry, I was just saying, I think in our part of the world, politics is not very polarised, because it's pretty much all safe Conservative seats. Shepparton's a bit unusual in that they have an independent, but virtually the rest of Northern Victoria is fairly securely in the Conservative camp, and so there's not much political argument goes on.
In the northeast, it's a little bit different, because we have an independent member.
Well, I think being in the city, it's something that people know is there, but they don't really know where to go. They need some guidance. They need a lot more guidance on what they can do individually, because as a group, it doesn't seem to exist from Sunday till Sunday, which is a pity.
So look, the last thing I was going to mention, those resources I talked about, we actually did as a, from our end, we actually did a series of 3 sheets that had all those resources listed on them. So if anyone wanted that full list, let me know. I can send it through to Brian. I can send the list of 3. They have, hyperlinks you can click on if that was of use to you. Again, as I said, I mean, the whole, I certainly hope that what I presented you with was a kind of broader suite of things that you might think about doing. And I was really pleased to hear that, you've undertaken various different forms of action, and whether tonight has offered you some other things to think about to possibly get involved with. I mean, that would be the idea. I recognise there's no way any congregation would want to or be able to tackle all those things all at the one time. But there are incremental things that could be done in that space. I'm recognising we're past 8, so I'm happy to take any final comment or question, but I'm also conscious of your time. So,
thanks, Mark. I think if you could send me those links when I I'll put the recording of this up, and I'll also include the links for people to be able to follow on the website.
thanks, that'd be great.
Thank you very much. It's been a really informative and very practical approach to what we can do at a local level.
Well, look, thank you so much for the opportunity. Really appreciate it, and thanks to all of you for giving up, part of your Wednesday night to be part of this and have the discussion. So really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Mark.
Well, thank you, everybody. So that'll look for that up on our Presbytery website, and I'll publish it there. And tomorrow night we have Heather Woodman from our Colburn Avon congregation, who's going to be leading a thing on living simply, and particularly as a young family, how you work with young children and getting them to appreciate and relate to the environment. So again, thanks, Mark, and thanks everyone for your time tonight.
Thanks, Brian.
Yeah.